So let's talk about acts, dramatic acts and structural acts. So an act is a unit. It's a chapter, basically, of a larger narrative. In it, certain events take place that propel the narrative forward. So in dramatic acts, as I've talked about, there are always three. And in every narrative, there are three dramatic acts. It's just how we tell stories. If you want to put it in the simplest of terms, it's beginning, middle, end. The length of the acts change, but the events that take place in the sequence don't. Even if the story is told out of order, non-sequentially, it's still going to follow this three-act arc. Now, I want to go through those first, and then I'm going to talk very briefly about the structural acts of feature-length films. So the first dramatic act, exposition. In the first act of any story, a few things need to happen. We need to be given all the necessary information in order to be able to move forward with the story. Simplest version would be to think murder mystery, right? We need to find out who's involved, who are the potential suspects, who's going to be solving this crime, what is the crime. That's usually going to happen right at the end of Act 1. We need all the clues necessary to be able to solve the puzzle ourselves. If something's going to be important later in the story, we need to see it up front. You cannot just show up later. Oh, by the way, magic is possible. We need to have it introduced to at least that potential early on. We meet all the characters. We're introduced into the world. Everything is established. Now, in a short story, this might be a paragraph. In a film, it might be longer. In a play, it all depends. That's going to end with the transition into Act 2. Act 2 is where the quest is moving forward, whatever that journey is. It is defined, however, by twist. Something we thought was true is untrue. Now, this can be small. They don't all have to be giant twists that completely change what you thought was happening. But something changes where we thought this was the villain, but actually he's a pawn for this person. Where we thought this person was kind, but actually they're cruel. Or, of course, we thought this person had murdered our father, when in fact they are our father. So that's what defines Act 2. It's moving forward. And then Act 3 is resolution. It's also called catastrophe because it's everything coming together, but obviously it doesn't have to be, as we think of, catastrophic. Resolution, then, everything comes together. All the different threads are either resolved or come together to resolve at the end in some way. So that basic structure we're going to see in literally any story, any narrative. Now, moving then into structural acts, talking specifically here about feature-length films. Now, feature-length films evolved over time, but it's built on a 120-minute idea. Now, the average movie is not 120 minutes. It's about 107. But they're built on a framework, and they have a very, very rigid structure, which can seem confining at first, and will actually when you look at a lot of films, because films that are sort of uninspired and boring, they just plug in the parts. And they do seem like the structure becomes limiting. But if you think about structure, it doesn't have to be that way. If you look at poetry, sonnets, things like that, poems have very, very rigid structures sometimes. And it isn't because they're trying to confine you, that's what defines it. And the task is, how do you do something new, something interesting within those confines? So then the structural acts of a movie, as odd as this may sound, there's actually a little bit of debate whether there's 3 or 4. But for simplicity's sake and clarity's sake, and because I'm right, let's say there's 4. 4 30-minute acts. Structurally. Again, when you go to a play and there's an intermission, it could be because it's a 2-act play. Most Shakespeare works were 5-act structural plays. Films then have 4 structural acts with a break point, which we'll get into more detail later. But here's the key thing. The structure is going to start getting more and more and more detailed because each structural act, here's where it starts to get complicated, is itself a mini story. Remember I said it was a chapter, a section. Well, that section has its own story to tell, which means within that 30-minute structural act, there's a 3-act dramatic structure going on because that structural act has its own part of the story that it's telling, which has a beginning, and information. It has a twist in the middle, however tiny, and it reaches a resolution, which sets up the next structural act. And so we're going to see 4 mini stories over the course of that. So the film as a whole, one big 3 dramatic act arc. Within those 4 structural acts, 4 more mini stories that add up to the bigger one, each of which has a beginning, middle, and an end. Now, when I say that they evolved, what I mean by that is when they first started showing films and they started getting longer and longer, a reel on a projector could hold 30 minutes of film. So they would show the 30 minutes, and then they'd have to stop, rewind the reel, take it off, put on a new one, start it back up again. So naturally, very quickly, people thought, well, don't just stop mid-scene, create an act break there. Right? A chapter ending, a cliffhanger often, something that gives some resolution, but also makes people want to know what's going to come next. So this just grew into this 30-minute structure. Beyond that, even, what we saw over time then is people come to expect it. It's sort of a circular thing. There's no authority saying you must do it this way. If people come to expect things to be 30 minutes for 30-minute acts, so people are going to say, well, I'm going to do it that way. So we come to expect it more. Dramatic acts are largely focused on the journey of the character, and often metaphoric or spiritual or emotional. They follow the physical, but they're not focused on that. The structural acts are more about what is physically driving the events of this plot. So that's the basic of acts. It's about to get more and more complex because, as you'll see, the rigidity of the structure in film as it evolved leaves a lot of room for people to do interesting things and are surprisingly complex. And that's how gradually, and I'll get into more detail as we get into the smaller units, this very, very rigid structure has evolved.